Hello, my name's Sam Emmett and welcome to this video tutorial lecture PowerPoint presentation on principles and requirements of assessment, which is designed to supplement in-session activities that we'll have done upon this, or for those people who are looking into doing assessment qualifications at level 2 or 3. Okay, so this is on Adult Learning Wales and for Adult Learning Wales because this is who I'm tutoring for at the moment. Okay, so we're looking at explaining the functions of assessment in learning and development, defining some of the key concepts and principles of assessment, and explaining the responsibilities and requirements relevant to assessment in your own area of practice. So, what's the function of assessment? So, assessment normally is considered is a way of finding out if learning has taken place. And Gravel's 2016, but it's more than that, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But the common function of assessment is that we are using it to assess that learning has taken place, and that it is a particular standard or benchmark has been achieved, and that is the qualification that you would then be awarded. But assessment is also how we form judgments about learning, how we are thinking about what that learning is and how we're judging that learning. So we have to think about how we form those judgments in that assessment, and therefore the assessment we need to think about how we're going to form judgments. How are we going to mark it is quite important. And also assessments, as Sir Ken Robinson argued in 2016, is we should use assessment to influence learning. Yeah, it's not just teaching and learning and passing a test. That assessment should have real value. It should have real value to that learning and therefore influence the learning. And once the assessment is seen to be influencing the learning and having value in itself, then learners are more likely to engage with it and be motivated by it and to see its value. Okay, and obviously quite clearly is that assessment, if we're going to use it to influence learning, then the assessment should be contingent on what the students have learned or are learning, so that while we're teaching we need to collect evidence all the time about where students are, that we can then make adjustments to our teaching to meet our students' learning needs, which is formative assessment. And that's where the daily inaction little mini assessments that we're making as learning is happening, that are using to make sure that the longer term the learners are going to be able to achieve. Okay, so no assessment can be perfect. It's not a reason for dispensing altogether with summative assessment. It is an argument that summative assessment, it is an argument for taking it seriously and designing and administering it carefully and for keeping it under review, Winch and Gengel. So it's really quite important to note that no matter what your function is and no matter what your assessment is there is no perfection. It cannot be perfect. There are going to be aspects which are not as good as they can be, and this is where sometimes you need to look at, well, not one singular assessment, a multitude of assessments made through time or at different times, because that helps, but also to have a look at how we can make them as fair and as close to that as we can. So I just got to pause a sec. Okay, so then we're going to just look at some of these concepts. So we've got accountability, transparency, progressions, benchmarking, achievement, types of assessment, strategies, evaluation, internally and externally devised. So accountability is that we need to be accountable to the learners and to the organisation, and to make sure that we're carrying out our role as an assessor fairly. So we also need to be accountable to the external quality and the internal quality assessors to make sure that the quality is of the standard that is required of your organisation, but also of the qualification. So in here you're also having to use internal organisation policies and approaches to make sure that your approaches are in line with your organisation. With achievement, we're looking at analysing those achievements to make sure that the levels that are being achieved are related to the learner's achievement, and that they are mapped and agreed to a particular standard, and that they can be achievable within a particular time scale. You can't just expect somebody to write a 20,000 word assignment in 2 days. So you've got to look at what is realistic and how achievable that is in the time available. Benchmarking, and that's the really important one. So benchmarking is, for these qualifications to be awarded, it has to hit that recognised standard. So in a GORID qualifications and a lot of qualifications, these will be the relevant learning criteria or outcomes, and that you're measuring those learning to those outcomes, so that therefore you have achieved a particular level and standard. So as well as those outcomes, you're also looking at the level 1, level 2, level 3 to make sure the learner is at the right level. So the benchmark is the level and the criteria. Obviously we got types of assessment. So obviously there's initial, formative and summative. Now we have to pay attention to what those assessments are doing and when. The initial assessment is going to create records on particular learners about strengths, weaknesses, additional learning needs, personal data, so that qualification can be sent to them. So that's when we also have to start paying attention to Gdpr and document and records, making sure that we're securing them safely, following our organisation's policies. And also, if we then go and create a group profile based from that, we have to think about safeguarding issues and also confidentiality. What somebody has said to us in private isn't something that should be shared. So you have to make sure you're keeping those records in line with any confidentiality procedures. Progression. So progression should take account of where learners are and where they're going next. So in a unit you might have a multitude of assessments and they might build. So you're thinking about the assessment needs to be paying attention to what assessments have gone before, but what assessments are coming further down the line. Evaluate is that the assessment processes are informing current and future practice, that it's fit for purpose, and that all aspects of the assessment cycle, which I take in another session, are being adhered to on an ongoing basis, and feedback is being obtained through all of the routes. That is making sure in this case that the assessment and method of assessment is suitable, that you're evaluating it. Transparency is you need to make sure that everyone who is involved in the assessment process clearly understands what is expected. So your learners need to know what's expected of them, what are the criteria, what do they have to do, what do they have to do to achieve that assessment, how do they achieve it by, but also other people. So other people involved in that, the IQA and the EQA and managers and other tutors, all need to be clear that nothing untoward is taking place and that everybody can see what's going on and that it's fair and just for purpose. Okay, internally and externally devised assessment. I forgot I put that on this slide. It's quite interesting in the fact that sometimes you'll have assessments that are already preset that you have to adhere to. So there's one type of external assessment. Internally is when you're designing them within your organisation and they're being agreed with your IQA process and EQA process with the awarding body. But you also have to look at assessment on what it's for. So if you've got things like apprenticeships, you're not going to bring them into a college or somewhere like that. Their assessments need to be externally devised assessment, where they're doing their assessment in their setting. It's the whole point about contextualising or situated learning in apprenticeships. So those assessments would be in action doing what they're doing. So that's what that means. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the key principles. So there are different principles, but a common one and a very nice one to adopt to is what we call VACAs, valid, authentic, current, reliable, sufficient. So valid is when you're making your assessment, that that it is made against the outcomes or learning criteria. So this is where it's constructively aligned to the criteria. So your assessment is mapped directly to those criteria. And you also have to make sure that the particular unit or particular qualification you're doing is still current, is still in date. So with a GORID, units are refreshed after X particular time, or in date or out of date. You've got to make sure the unit's still in date, otherwise the whole thing is just not valid at all. Authentic. There's two elements to authentic. Is it the learner? Is that learner actually the learner who you're assessing? So you need to have evidence of that learner. You need to know who they are. You might need personal identification in an examination hall. You know, they might have to bring their driving license to make sure the right person is there. In a video, you'll just need to make sure that you can prove it's that person. It's tricky on an audio recording. You have to get somebody to give you a statement to prove that it's their work. But also that the work that they're doing is their own work, that it is authentic in terms that it is their work and not somebody else's. So this is plagiarism. So this is where, you know, somebody might copy and paste and put work in and claim it as their own, which is just not acceptable, especially at levels 2 and 3, or more at 3 and above. So, and they're copying and pasting, and you can get your whole exam questions answered online, and you're just popping them in. So we need to check for plagiarism. So a lot of the time you'll use something like a plagiarism scanner to check whether the work has been copied, and if it has, then obviously that's not authentic, and you need to use your appeals procedures. So some of the documents you're going to need in this hand are appeals procedure, what to do if something isn't authentic, what routes to take. You need plagiarism scanners to make sure that you can check the work. You might need text to check those, and also you're going to need like documents such as, you know, driving license, evidence of identification, email addresses. And also, with all of that information, you've got to think about keeping it secure. So you've got confidentiality and GDPR issues which are at play here. Okay, current. Is the work current? Is it up to date? Now, two aspects of this again. So sometimes a learner might have finished a course in July but not submit work until December or the following July, and therefore is that work still current? You know, is it? It's not that it was current to when it should have been assessed, it's current to when it's handed in. Things can change, so you've got to make sure that the currency of that is still valid for assessment purposes. But also you need to make sure that any particular documents or legislation that people are using as part of their courses or for their assessments are up to date. Legislation changes, and it changes quite regularly, as do codes of practice. Are you using the latest code of practice? And this is especially the case in care home settings where things can change very quickly, and if you're using something that's out of date, it's no longer valid or fit for purpose. Reliable. Is the assessment method that you're going to use, is the assessment reliable? Can it be achieved by a similar group of learners in other settings and at other times? If not, then one group is advantaged or disadvantaged, and that is not fair, and we'll get to fairness in a minute. So you're looking to make sure that the assessment evidence that you're getting can be achieved by other groups and other times, in other times and in other places. Sufficient, so for your assessment method or assessment type, is there enough? Have you got enough to meet that criteria? If a criteria says we need you to discuss 3 different approaches, then you're going to need to discuss at least 3. If you discuss 2, you haven't met it. If it says a range, well, that's more than a couple, so you're going to need at least 3 again. But also in terms of demonstrating, doing something that is, and I should come to that, demonstrating, doing something that is a skill, just seeing a very short aspect of that is not enough. You know, if you could say, right, I'll observe you riding a bike for 2 seconds, well, that's not really enough, because you can't really prove, that's not sufficient evidence of riding a bike. You're going to need to see more than that. Okay, and what I should have done then with reliable, current, authentic and valid is there are basically two aspects with assessments. You've got understanding and you've got demonstrate. Understand are knowledge based, demonstrate are normally skills based. So you've got to make sure that your method matches that particular type. So it's no good doing an exam on riding a bicycle, because that doesn't actually prove that you can ride a bicycle. It just proves you can write about it. And there's a very, yes, so I think that answers that. Yeah, so you have to make sure that you've got an assessment method that suits a demonstrate, a skill-based, or an assessment method that suits a knowledge, normally a written or evidence of cognitive understanding. Okay, now a couple of others I just want to deal with whilst we're here. So fair. Can all participants achieve, succeed? So it's a bit like this reliable, is that it's got to be fair. It's got to be something that people with different abilities could achieve. You can't just do it because you're rich enough to say you can't get, okay, you know, what's the weather like in Rome? Well, those people who are rich enough can go to Rome. No, it's got to be something that is fair to all of the participants on the course, and it's something that they can all achieve. And objectivity. So an assessment is not as it can easily become biased or not quite clear. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that other tutors would get the same information or deliver it in the same way or assess it in the same way. So this is where you use some standardization meetings, you follow organizational policies. You might engage in second marking with other tutors to make sure that no one tutor is cheating people unfairly or differently to anybody else. And this is also where your IQA will be looking at your assessment and your assessment methods to make sure that it is objective and it is fair. And as I've said throughout this security, we remember that there are quite a lot of personal details and personal work. You know, sometimes evidence might be gained by a video. Well, that is somebody's private. You know, you've got to think about the confidentiality issues and think about how you're storing all of the relevant data, especially with the initial assessment stuff. Okay, so there are some other key principles. Communicating, so you need to communicate, keep those channels open with the learners, other assessors, and anybody else that's involved. You know, if somebody's in a workplace setting, then you're going to be including their employers. People are going to know what's going on with these assessments, and everybody's going to know what's going on so that everybody is aware of where everybody is. CPD, so this is maintaining the currency. So this is this currency again, current, making sure that skills and knowledge are up to date, are suitable for the assessment, and also that they're suitable for the subject in the workplace where you will be putting them into place. Motivation, so we need to be thinking about encouraging and supporting learners to reach their maximum potential. With motivation, it's something that's not always thought about in terms of assessment, is we need to motivate the learners. If the learners are really engaged in that assessment and it's one that they like and really are going to put their all in, then they get more value and they'll get more out of it. Quality assurance, we've got to make sure activities and decisions are meeting those required standards. So where we've got criteria that we're working to in a level, that we need to make sure that we're reaching those fairly, not going too far, because you can over-assess sometimes. It's about making sure that they are hitting that quality that's required. And this is where you're going to work with quality professionals in your organisation, your IQA, and in turn with the EQA. As I mentioned before, we need to think about our record keeping, think about how we're keeping that secure, etc. Equality and diversity, we need to make sure that assessment activities embrace equality and that they are representative of all aspects of society. So that is different race, culture, belief, but also paying attention to, you know, society. You have single parents, you know, is it fair on single parents as well as those people who aren't single parents? Has everybody got the same chance of succeeding? Ethics, you know, is it honest? Does it take into account confidentiality and integrity, which are tying into some of the other ones? Fairness, is it fair? Is it fit for purpose? Is what you're asking for justifiable? Do all learners have an equal chance of achieving it? By the way, I think I've got it on the slide, but my face might be covering it at the moment. This is all coming out of Anglovel's 2016 Principles and Practices of Assessment, and also the some of her other work has it in there. It's similar to other people. We need to take into account health and safety, especially in demonstrating and in work-based type settings. You know, we need to really make sure that we're not putting our learners at risk. SMART, that our assessment activities are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. It's no good having an assessment where they have to write a 20,000-word essay, but you're only going to give them an hour. You have to make sure that all of those SMART principles apply. And you also have to you're taking responsibility. So you're making objective decisions, you're following your guidelines, and there are organisational guidelines that you'll need to pay attention to, as well as professional standards, which in Wales would be the EWC. So we'll look at those a little bit later, I think. And standardisation. So this is really quite important, ensuring that assessment requirements are interpreted accurately, that all assessors are making comparable and consistent decisions. And these are things like standardisation meetings, having a look at something, you all talking about it, seeing what you would have done, and making sure that learners are not being treated unfairly by one tutor or another. So that brings us to a whole host of different regulations, policies and procedures that are going to potentially impact on us. So food hygiene, if you're doing anything to relate with food, when obviously you have to pay attention to food hygiene regulations. Fair assessment, which we've already looked at. RIDA, reporting of disease of dangerous or accidents. If anything like that happens in an assessment, especially a practical assessment, then you need to know what those policies are, and if it's a reportable accident, health and safety executive are going to need to be involved. Nowadays, quite often people are working at home. At the moment, obviously, I'm delivering from home, so I need to be looking at the lone working policies and procedures of my organisation. Copyright, anything that I may or may not be allowed to use. Plagiarism, obviously making sure that there's a plagiarism statement from your organisation about what is allowed and what isn't allowed and how to check it. ALN and SEN, are we following our additional learning needs, special education and needs policies? Have we put into place procedures that match those? Safeguarding, appeals and complaints, do learners know how they can appeal a decision? On what those procedures are. The learners will need that, and I will need that. Manual handling, if it's relevant. IQA and EQA policies, processes and reports. We're using those to make sure our assessments are fair and fit for purpose, and that we're taking the advice from both of those to develop our own practice going forward. We have to think about freedom of information, so we have anything on record, how that's going to be handled. You'll normally need to pay attention to your particular policy so that you know who to refer that to. EWC, which hopefully, yes, we will look at in a minute. He says looking to see what slides are coming. Education Workforce Council, or in England that would be SET. So there's all kinds of regulations, policies and procedures which are going to impact on assessment, even though you wouldn't have thought about them in the first place. You might not have thought about health and safety, but you do have to pay attention to that when people are doing assessments, even if they're doing them at home. Okay, so some key ones are GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations 2016. So this is a way of protecting personal data, and some of the key privacy and data requirements include requiring consent of subjects for data processing, anonymizing collected data, protecting data breach notifications, safe handling of data across organisations. and requiring certain companies to appoint protection officers. Health and Safety at Work Act. Well, obviously at any classroom you'll need to have a risk assessment in place. Your organisation will probably have one, but also you need to be checking that site just before you deliver. Are there any loose or trailing cables? Is any of the furniture damaged? And then adapting that space. Welsh in Language Act. Well, obviously there is a Welsh language adult learning Wales has the right to submit their work in Welsh or be taught in Welsh wherever possible. So you need to make sure that you're aware of this regulation. Welsh culture. There's still Wellbeing for Future Generations Act, which is legislation in Wales, probably one of the best pieces of legislation that a country's ever had. And Welsh culture is protected in this because it makes more resilient communities. So we need to pay attention to embedding Welsh culture into our assessments and into our teaching. And obviously Safeguarding Act. So these are a little bit more of thinking about. So with safeguarding, your safeguarding policies, a safeguarding issue comes up, you have no choice, you need to act on it, and you're going to follow your safeguarding policies, which in most cases will be reporting to a safeguarding officer. Although if it's really worrying, you can always go to the police. Okay. So practitioners also need to pay attention to the Education Workforce Council's Code of Practice. This applies in Wales, anybody who is in educational delivery. And with these there are 5 aspects, 2 areas, professional conduct and professional practice. And with this you need to be paying to personal and professional responsibility, what you're responsible for in terms of personal and professional within the workplace, professional integrity, collaborative working, professional knowledge and understanding, professional learning. Now there are a whole host of stuff on the EWC website about all of this that you're going to need to have a look at, but what's really important in terms of assessment is collaborative working with others to be standardized, but also the professional knowledge and understanding to make sure that your knowledge and awareness on assessment on your subject area is up to date. So you're going to have to be involved in all of that and identifying any professional learning that's going to help with your assessment. And also most of this is reflective practice, so it's reflecting on what you're doing to identify where you're going next. Okay, some of the organisational policies that you're really going to need to pay attention to and make sure that you're adhering to and that are in line with your assessments are going to be the IQA policy, internal quality assessment policy, following those policies and procedures, submitting your work to the IQA and then receiving back from them. Complaints procedure, being aware of what the complaints are, knowing how to help your learners identify those and complain against an appeal decision. Additional learning needs, know what your organisations are, direct them to the ALNCO specialist. It's the same for safeguarding and confidentiality. All of these policies you're going to need on a daily basis, and especially in assessment and assessment decisions. Okay, so some of the references I've used here, there you go, Cravell's Principles and Practices of Assessment, Sir Ken Robinson and Assessment. It's a YouTube video, it's really interesting, please watch it. Dylan William Assessment for Learning Why, What and How, and Winchon Gengel Philosophy and Educational Policy, Critical Introduction. Okay, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask me, and I hope that we now are able to have an awareness and explain the functions of assessment in learning development. We've defined some key concepts and principles, and we've looked at responsibilities and requirements. Thank you very much.